Go back to the 1970s, and when you had recessions in the 1970s, they were actually disinflationary once the unemployment rate spiked, even in the 1970s, right? So you look at 74, 75, you look at the end of the 70s going into the 80s, even though it was in a decade of high inflation, when you had the unemployment rate spike, you had disinflation. Now, inflation was still high, but 74, 75 is an example. Going into 76, I think inflation was maybe 10, 12%, something like that. And going into 76, it was maybe 5, which again, is still very high. But the fact is you had disinflation. So I would suggest your viewers to really focus on the labor market. So I would also like to remind them that during 2008, which we know how that movie ended, it did not end with inflation or stagflation. It ended with disinflation and deflation going into 2009. But during 2008, oil was doing what? Going to 140 a barrel. And what did we have during that time? You had the CPI going up. Most people forget this because we just focus on how the movie ended. But we forget about how it started and what happened in the middle. And when the Fed started cutting rates in September of 2007, the CPI was at 3.5. Then you fast forward to July of 2008, and the CPI was at 5.6. Why? Because oil created that short-term increase in the CPI. But it's not how the movie ended. The movie ended in the opposite, not with stagflation, but disinflation, deflation. And why was that? Because the oil price shock, if you want to call it that, was combined with a deteriorating economy and a deteriorating labor market. That's the key variable. So what ends up happening is the oil price becomes a tax on the consumer and a tax on the economy. So they have to put gas in their car. They don't have a choice. But if gas goes from $3 a gallon to $10 a gallon, now you have to take that purchasing power away from somewhere else. Yep. That's your discretionary, your disposable income. So therefore you spend less money at Target. You spend less money at Walmart. So whenever we see a cycle like this, it usually does start with an inflation or a stagflation, to your point, but that's rarely how it ends. Another thing I'd like to remind everyone is the ECB raised rates in July of 2008, when 2 months later, they were at zero because this stuff absolutely hit the fan after Lehman Brothers. And this was after Bear Stearns. So why did they raise rates? Because they were scared of inflation. They were scared of stagflation. It's because they thought that the oil price shock would lead to a sustained level of accelerating inflation, as opposed to what it turned out to be, which was the straw that broke the camel's back. Private credit is subprime credit. Right. I don't care if it's to another business or to a mortgage borrower that can't pay back the loan. It's still toxic sludge on the balance sheets, and the banks are obviously exposed to that. Now, they might not have lent to the tricolors, if you will, directly, but they did it through the shadow banking route. So now the shadow banks are blowing up. And this is not just George Gammon saying that. Anybody that's been watching the news, you know, it started with Blue Owl, and then it's Blackstone. Now it's BlackRock. Now it's JP Morgan. Now it's Morgan Stanley. Now it's Deutsche Bank. All of these have come out and said that they have significant exposure to the subprime private credit. Whenever you see financial institutions halting redemptions, that is a huge red flag. And what do you think Paul Atkins, by the way, was doing between 2002 and 2008? He was a commissioner at the SEC. So while all this fraud was going on under his watch prior to the GFC, which led to the GFC, this was Paul Atkins was your guy. And then what did he do? He gets into the private credit space, and then he quits that in 2025 because Trump nominates him for the new SEC chair. He wants to get rid of quarterly reporting for publicly traded companies because he wants the publicly traded companies to be more of a black box, just like the private credit guys that have been able to keep up this ruse, which is effectively a scam. So for one of these fund managers, they have no risk and all upside. That's why I call it a free call option. So they take in $10 billion and it's all marketing because they know that they're investing in garbage companies that will never, ever, ever come back. Just like the banksters knew that they were giving loans to people that could barely fog a mirror back in 2007. You've got massive fraud. You have a blow up in what effectively is subprime credit that will absolutely impact the balance sheets of the banks. I mean, JP Morgan even admitting that it's going to impact their balance sheets, and they're going to have to write down some of these loans that they had as collateral, right? Now, am I saying that JP Morgan's going to go bust? No, I'm not saying that. Am I saying that we're going to have a GFC like that's going to be exactly like what played out in 2008? I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is our economy and the global economy depends on the circulation of money and credit. So what happens is the Fed doesn't control that with bank reserves because it's all about risk. The GFC that we had was really not a subprime crisis, in my view. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, along with oil and everything else. It was an extremely weak economy. Look at the non-farm payrolls. And that's kind of what tipped it over the edge. But the reason we went from just a normal recession into a GFC is because the circulation of money and credit stopped. Because what they were using as collateral for the circulation of money and credit was something called a mortgage-backed security. And when you're circulating all of this oil for the engine at those mortgage-backed securities being valued at 100 cents on the dollar, and all of a sudden overnight they're valued at 10 cents on the dollar, there's no more collateral. And if there's no more collateral, there's no more circulation. If there's no more circulation, the engine freezes up. That's really at the core of what took 2008 from a dot-com bust recession into a global financial crisis. So you can't sit there and ask the question, well, what's JP Morgan's exposure or Wells Fargo exposure directly to Blue Owl? That's the wrong question to answer. You have to answer the question, what does this do to perceived counterparty risk in the financial economy with the financial institutions? And what does that do? Could we see a seizure as a result of the circulation of money and credit, which then would lead to a GFC type of event, a very severe recession? Now, would the banks go bust? No, because even if they got into trouble, we've got a knee jerk, we got a hair trigger right now on them being bailed out. So I'm saying in the economy, the way it's going to feel is the same way. What I mean by that is the unemployment rate, it likely spikes, just like we saw during the GFC. Now, does it go to 8%, 9%? I don't know. But it likely we see something like that that impacts the vast majority of Americans. And let's not forget that the U.S. economy, unfortunately, is totally dependent on asset prices. So if you look at a chart right now, the S&P, it looks eerily similar to a chart in 2007, 2008, where you hit that high going into the new year, and then it just starts to roll over. And so now it's different from the standpoint that the economy is much more dependent on these asset prices, and the S&P 500 is far more dependent on passive inflows. So what you have to do, going back to the labor market, is you have to look at the unemployment rate, because that's really your proxy for when those passive inflows become right into those S&P index funds. So many of your viewers, I'm sure, sit there and they look at the stock market, which is in absolute bubble. But they sit there and say, well, it just keeps going up. It's all, you've got to buy the dip, for heaven's sakes. Why is that? Why can there be such a disconnect and often an inverse correlation between the real economy and the S&P 500? The main reason is because of these passive flows, where the stock market is just turned into everyone's retirement fund. And people have just become robotic because they're now so complacent because they have recency bias. And you look at just the last 20 years or whatever, and if you buy the dip, and if you just do this passive investing, you don't have to pay a manager 2 and 20. You just pay the 50 basis points in your S&P index fund. You know, Dave Ramsey and everyone on social media tells you that that's the right thing to do. So you have people doing this in mass, and they don't do valuations. They don't care if it's in a bubble. They don't care what's happening. They just invest that 10% every single month. And that's what drives the S&P higher and higher. And that's why the unemployment rate is so important. Mike said about 5.5 to 6 as far as his read on the unemployment rate. Once it gets, let's say, 6 or 7 on unemployment, then based on his models, you go from a net outflow, and then that huge tailwind that we've had in the S&P 500 for the last 20 years becomes a headwind at the exact wrong time. And oh, by the way, you've got AI that all else being equal. Let's just say we don't go into a recession. AI in and of itself will likely take the unemployment rate to, I mean, let's speak and say 7%. I get pushback on this. That's, to me, is a little bit bizarre from the standpoint of they say, well, that's not really going to impact the economy because the robots or the AI or whatever, you know, they're more, so you're going to have GDP actually increase because the AI is more productive than the humans. I'm like, okay, who's going to buy the widget? That the robot is more productive in producing. If no one's got a job, then there's no aggregate demand. Yeah, I think you go into a UBI world because it's going to be just like the cerveza sickness, where all these people had to quit their jobs or not going to work, or their business had to shut down because of the government locking you in a cage, and it's at no fault of their own. And therefore, let's just give them quote unquote free money. I agree with the argument. I don't agree with the quote unquote solution, which caused, or one of the main causes of the inflation that we've had over the last few years. But they're going to use the same argument again, that, oh, this truck driver, he just lost his job because now a robot can do it a lot better than he can. It's at no fault of his own. And we're going to go into an economic death spiral if we have, mass like the Great Depression. So what are we going to do? We're just going to give people free money, or they're going to do something like FDR did. I always say that Trump is like FDR 2.0. Did you know that the only person that's had more executive orders than FDR in the first 3 months of his term was Donald Trump?